He only meant to help a stranger survive the cold night. But when a struggling single dad revives a silent woman at a hotel, he never expects her to sit at the old piano and play the unfinished melody his late wife used to hum, the one no one else was supposed to know. Who is she? And why does her music sound like a memory that was never shared, but always meant for him? This isn't just a story about music. It's a story about healing, second chances, and the quiet kind of love that changes everything. If stories of kindness, hope, and unexpected connections speak to your heart, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story that reminds us. Sometimes, the softest melodies stay with us the longest. Now, let's begin. The wind had teeth that night. It howled across the frozen Montana plains like a restless spirit, slapping against the wooden frame of Winter Pines Inn, where Caleb Whitaker had just started his overnight shift. He exhaled into his gloved hands, watching the puff of breath vanish into the dark. The air carried that sharp metallic scent of an oncoming storm, the kind that settled in your bones long before the flakes began to fall. Caleb adjusted the scarf around his neck, the one Lila had knitted him last Christmas, with red and gray loops too loose to hold much warmth but tight enough to hold his heart. He smiled at the memory of her tiny hands holding the needles with fierce concentration. That scarf was reason enough to brave any storm. He pushed open the back door of the inn and stepped outside, shovel in hand. The snow had started to collect along the front steps. Just a thin dusting, but enough to freeze into slick patches that could send a guest flying. Not that they had many guests this time of year. Winter Pines was more a resting place for weary travelers who stumbled off the beaten path, not a destination. Still, it mattered to Caleb. Every shift, every detail, because the work, quiet, physical, repetitive, kept his mind busy, and his grief from settling too deep. He was halfway through clearing the front steps when he saw it. A shape. At first, he thought it was a blanket or maybe a bag someone had dropped, but then it moved, barely, and his breath caught in his throat. He dropped the shovel and rushed forward. It was a woman, curled like a question mark at the bottom of the stairs, her coat dusted in white, her hair dark and tangled. She wasn't unconscious but close. Her lips were pale, her eyes unfocused, and she wasn't wearing gloves. "Hey, hey!" Caleb crouched beside her, gently shaking her shoulder. "Can you hear me? Are you okay?" No answer, just a low, guttural sound, almost like a whimper. She tried to shift away from him, instinctively curling tighter. "You're freezing." He stripped off his gloves and slid his arms under her, lifting her with the ease of a man who'd spent years carrying a sleeping child up the stairs. She was lighter than he expected. Scary light. Inside the inn, he carried her straight to the staff lounge. He laid her gently on the worn leather couch, turned the space heater toward her, and threw his coat over her legs. "Stay with me," he said, almost to himself. "Don't fade." He ran to the front desk and grabbed the first aid kit, then returned to find her eyes half open. They were the softest gray he'd ever seen, like the last light before a snowstorm. "I'm going to warm your hands, okay?" he said, rubbing them between his own. "You're safe." She didn't speak, didn't nod, but something in her gaze shifted, like the faintest flicker of trust or maybe recognition. By the time the paramedics arrived, she'd stabilized, though she still hadn't said a word. Caleb stayed with her through the checkup, hovering nearby while she sat, swaddled in 2 blankets, sipping warm water. The paramedics didn't push her. They asked if she knew her name. No answer. If she had anyone to call. Nothing. If she wanted to go to the hospital. She shook her head, slowly but firmly. "She might be dealing with trauma," one of them said to Caleb. Sometimes silence is the first thing the mind takes when it's trying to survive. They left, leaving her in Caleb's care with a note that if she changed her mind, she could come to the clinic any time. He pulled a chair over and sat across from her. "You don't have to talk, but if you want to stay the night, I'll find you a warm room. Just nod, if that's okay." She nodded once. "All right, let's get you upstairs." Room 12 was the smallest, but coziest. Caleb set up a kettle for tea, added extra blankets, and placed a note with the Wi-Fi code on the nightstand. Habit, even if she wouldn't use it. As he was about to leave, she pointed to a small bag that had fallen beside her coat. "Of course." He handed it to her. The leather was worn, the zipper frayed. As she clutched it to her chest, a thin slip of fabric slipped out. An old scarf with a single embroidered note stitched into the corner. A musical note, treble clef, stitched in faded blue. Caleb's breath hitched. His wife, Grace, had once embroidered that same symbol on the back of her piano bench. She used to say music was the language that reached where words couldn't. He shook the thought away. Coincidence, just coincidence. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching her settle into the bed, eyes open, staring into something only she could see. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything," he said quietly. "I'm Caleb." No answer. But as he turned to leave, her eyes followed him. And just before the door closed, she blinked, slow, deliberate. Not goodbye, not quite thank you, but something. That night, as the storm finally rolled in, Caleb stood in the dark hallway outside the room 12, listening to the silence beyond the door. And somehow, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was just beginning. By morning, the world outside Winter Pines Inn had been muffled under a thick, glistening quilt of snow. The parking lot was empty. The only visible footprints were Caleb's, stretching from the front steps to the staff entrance and back again, blurred now by the steady fall of new snow. Inside room 12, silence hung like a second layer of frost. Caleb stood outside the door for a long moment, his hand hovering near the knob. He held a tray, tea, toast, and a small jar of blackberry jam, the kind Grace used to hoard in the back of their pantry like gold. Something about it felt right, comforting, familiar. He knocked twice, softly, and waited. No answer. "Morning," he said, pitching his voice gently, like one does with someone who's been startled too many times. "It's just me. I brought breakfast." Still nothing. He opened the door slowly. The woman was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, the blanket pulled around her shoulders like armor. Her dark hair tumbled down in uneven waves, framing a face that was striking not because of beauty, but because of how utterly guarded it was. She looked like someone who had learned not to flinch, but at great cost. Her eyes found him but didn't linger. She glanced down at the tray, then back at the window. "I figured you might be hungry," Caleb said. He walked in, set the tray down on the nightstand, and resisted the urge to say anything else. Grace had always told him, "Sometimes people just need your presence, not your answers." He turned to leave, but her hand lifted. Not much, just enough to halt him in place. She pointed to the tray, then to her lips, and slowly shook her head. "You can't eat?" he asked. A tiny shake. "You're not ready to?" A single nod. Caleb gave a quiet sigh and offered a soft smile. "Okay, I'll just leave it here, no pressure." As he reached the door, she did something unexpected. She tapped her chest lightly, then paused, then tapped again. Her brows pinched, like she was searching for a word that didn't exist anymore. Then she pointed at him. He tilted his head, trying to interpret. "You want to ask something?" he gasped. She shook her head and gestured again, this time slower. Tap her chest, pause, point at him. A realization bloomed. "Are you trying to say your name?" he asked.